I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Leader, Mr. Speaker, at this time, just like I said last week, I say it again this week. The COVID-19 pandemic will get worse before it gets better. It will get worse for our public health. It will get worse for our financial health. And that is why I rise in support of the CARES Act. With these shelter-in-place orders, we are continuing to trying to flatten the corona curve. But when we do that, figuratively, we are putting our economy in a medically induced coma, a step that, as we've seen this week, has led to one of the worst employment rates in our history. That is why we need one of the biggest stimulus packages in our history. The CARES Act will expand unemployment insurance for restaurant, retail, and hotel workers on the Central Coast of California. It will assist my specialty crop farmers in the salad and berry bowls of the world, and it will provide small businesses across this country with the loans necessary to survive. With this bruising pandemic, we are asking our constituents to do something that's not normal, to stand down, to stay inside, to separate from one another.
Gentleman's time
they are
expired.
Relying on us
Gentleman from
to do
Maryland,
the right thing,
reserves.
to step up and
the
to support the CARES Act. Thank you, Mr.
is
Speaker. I yield
recognized.
back.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz.
Gentleman from
Mr.
Florida is
Speaker,
recognized for
as
1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as a fiscal conservative, $2.2 trillion of our grandchildren's money is a tough pill to swallow. But this is a two-front war on our economy and on public health. On the economic front, we must provide a lifeline to individuals, businesses, seniors that are suffering collateral damage. And on the health front, we must send reinforcements to our healthcare workers. This morning, I spoke with a physician and family member heading into the emergency room in Manhattan. She said she's scared. Like combat, I told her, you have to take a deep breath, stay focused, and do what you're trained to do. These hospitals are the Omaha Beach of this war. Colleagues, in the foxhole, nobody cares about race, religion, creed, socioeconomic background. They certainly don't care about Republican and Democrat. It's about mission. It's about country. We have a duty to provide these soldiers what they need. We have a duty to support this bill. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I think that's changed. Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 10 days, I've seen the very best of America. I've seen restaurants like Umi Seafood and Lucille's Barbecue in Fort Wayne deliver thousands of meals to those who need it. I've seen TNT Floral Shop in Columbia City deliver flowers to every nursing home resident in my county. I've seen many lining up to donate blood. And I've seen so many healthcare professionals put themselves in harm's way on the front lines. Mr. Speaker, it's time for Congress to join them and bring relief to our neighbors who needed it yesterday. The CARES Act will keep the lights on in America. It will put cash in the hands of Americans who need help to pay their bills and put food on the table. And it will give a lifeline to small businesses when they need it most. This is by no means a perfect bill, but it gets help to the people who need it most. And I hope we will come back and make changes as needed in the near future. Mr. Speaker, in this time of national crisis, we must continue working together and with President Trump to keep our country in the fight. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 didn't kill our economy. Government policies, however well-intentioned, did that. In just a few weeks, they've derailed the most promising and prosperous economy of our lifetimes and put us in imminent danger of permanently destroying millions of American jobs. The unprecedented spending in this bill threatens to destabilize the fiscal structure of our federal government and suppress future economic growth. But in order to deal with those issues, we must first arrest the damage caused by the actions that have plunged us into a recession. Temporary job losses will soon become permanent job losses without federally guaranteed loans to preserve those jobs and a way for families to recoup their financial losses. This bill does so, although inefficiently, wastefully, and at enormous cost. Despite all its flaws, passage of this bill is therefore imperative. But it is no substitute for getting Americans back to
Gentleman
work
from
soon.
Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished colleague from Massachusetts, Ms. Trahan.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of this Congress, Democrats have committed themselves to a For the People agenda. Today is no different. The COVID-19 pandemic is impacting people across the world, our country, my district. And it is for the people that we stand here today to assist families, uplift workers whose basic livelihoods have been threatened, strengthen our community hospitals, and support our frontline healthcare workers. We are here to deliver relief to people, like the owner of a community bookstore in Andover, Massachusetts, whose business has been crushed, to keep our end of the bargain for the hospital workers at places like Lawrence General and Lowell Community Health Center, and so many others who are putting their lives on the line each day. And we are here for the families who are worried about their basic health and safety. This bill delivers for them. This is a time for bold action, and much more needs to come. For families struggling with the harsh realities of this situation, know that we will keep protecting you. We will take our lessons and courage from our frontline workers, from the families banding together to care for their loved ones, from the acts of kindness we are seeing all over our country as we stand united as Americans.
Gentleman
I support
from Virginia
this bill.
reserves.
Thank you. I yield
from
back.
Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remaining on both sides?
You have 20. Gentleman has 26 minutes, and the majority has 20 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Really pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman from
Speaker.
South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, during times like this, it brings out the best and the worst. The best has been a president who's working nonstop. The best have been those businesses who are producing the masks and the things that we need. The best has been the churches that are praying nonstop. Now, the worst has been the price tag, and the worst has been the things that were added to this that had nothing to do with the coronavirus. So $25 million for the Kennedy Center, $75 million for the National Arts. This has nothing to do with the coronavirus. This nation shall survive, and in the words of Winston Churchill, there are times when doing our best isn't good enough. We will do what's required in spite of this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to our friend from Florida, Mr. DeSoto.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as I rise here today, the United States has more coronavirus cases than any nation on the planet. This is an unprecedented crisis that requires an unprecedented response. This bipartisan bill is a promise that help is on the way. That help is on the way for families with $1,200 checks and $2,400 for married families, for food assistance, for the unemployed. Help is on the way with $600 in unemployment benefits on top of state benefits. Help is on the way for our seniors and our veterans with financial assistance. Help is on the way with small businesses through payroll grants and other costs. First responders and hospitals, help is on the way to confront this crisis. And to our farmers and to our students, help is on the way. It's time to pass this bipartisan bill and send a message to Central Florida and every American across every corner of this nation that there is help, because help and hope are on the way.
Gentleman's time. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members are asked to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman from Texas may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that this bill was delayed in pursuit of certain wasteful provisions that have nothing to do with the coronavirus. With that said, I'm thankful that the vast majority of this bill rightly focuses on the needs of Americans. It will save small business in my district, provides much-needed funds to the hospitals on the front lines of this fight, and provides a safety net for people who lose their jobs due to no fault of their own. America is hurting. The American people need us now more than ever. Thanks to Leader McCarthy and President Trump and the members involved for the unrelenting work on this. To the American people, it is much later than anyone wanted, but help is on the way. I urge a yes vote. May God bless us all. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to our friend from California, Mr. Cox.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of today's bill, which is a bipartisan, good faith effort to begin to provide relief to millions of American families and workers. And while not perfect, it's a good start. In the last few weeks, I spoke to thousands of my Central Valley neighbors. Last week, I had a town hall where 9,000 constituents called in. They're scared, they're worried, but they're looking for guidance and leadership. And today, they're looking for relief. No American should have to go between paying rent and putting food on their table. But without immediate assistance, this is exactly the choice they'll have to make. As a representative of the top ag district in the top ag state, I'm proud this bill shores up vital safety net programs for our farmers, ranchers, and their families. But I'm disappointed about this bill's glaring shortcomings, which must be remedied in a future bill. This bill punishes mixed status households and denies some American citizens benefits they deserve. It does not put a penny in the
Gentleman's
CDFI
time's
fund
expired.
to
Gentleman
help
from
distressed
Virginia
communities.
reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
We've gone from a story that barely affected Americans 3 weeks ago to a $2 trillion bill today. The cost is too high, but the crisis in response to government experts may be right and may be wrong, who said don't fly, don't eat out, don't worship together, don't go to school. Our economy was shattered. Was our president held up by irresponsible Democrats and too many irresponsible Republicans for excessive spending? Yes. But we must act to calm the panic and move back to normalcy. I flew here yesterday on the only Southwest flight from Milwaukee with 5 passengers. Usually there are 2 almost full flights. Restaurants are shuttered by the government and their employees are laid off. President Trump is right to act and stand up to the purists who would let businesses go under or who don't understand that even the greatest of presidents have had to compromise. I'm concerned about the unemployment benefits going over $900 a week, more than most Wisconsin people make. I want to help Americans laid off, but this provision delays the recovery, and I hope Americans don't bite on it. Stand with the president. Thank
Gentleman
you.
from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
He's got the updates.
I yield to the distinguished member from California, Mr. Carter. No. Yeah.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had 2 obligations in responding to this pandemic. First, to move quickly and urgently, and second, to put science and health ahead of partisan politics. Neither of those 2 things happened. But this bill is a step forward. It helps all the workers who have lost their jobs. It helps the businesses that are struggling with customers not showing up and staying home. And it helps the frontline nurses, doctors, first responders who need more equipment. There is more to do. As soon as we pass this bill, we need to keep working to make sure that we're expanding paid leave, to expand access to health care, and to make sure that we continue to protect each and every person who is out there as a first responder. But until then, I want to thank my friends on both sides of the aisle for working to get this done, and I urge us to pass it as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and please yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting hearing all this talk about we got to do it now, got to do it now. It's been delayed since last weekend because of our friends across the aisle. And then also, regarding the bill that we previously passed, it exempted the big corporations we're now hearing is so evil. So we need to get our story consistent here. But thank goodness the president put a travel ban in while some were trying to conspire, spy, impeach, but he kept being persistent, and as a result, there are fewer people with the disease. Now, $2 trillion is vastly too much money. but I spent much of the night reviewing all the sunsets in the bill. I'm satisfied that most of them will prevent most of the waste, but there's some pet projects in here. But it's time to turn back to the God that so many have turned from, and then use the tools we've got to help those that have been put in jeopardy. I will vote for the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Speaker, I now have the privilege of yielding to the distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Jim Clyburn of South Carolina.
How much time?
1 minute.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. I just want to take a moment to thank all of my colleagues for responding to what is an unprecedented event in the history of this country. Many of us who have studied history know full well that the country has been here before, and we have always recovered. The problem is, many times, that recovery is uneven. And what we have done with this legislation is created the opportunity to have a more equitable recovery taking place. And I thank you all for doing that. The fact of the matter is, this is a great country which does not have to be made great again. What we've got to do is make this country's greatness accessible and affordable for all Americans. This legislation makes an attempt to do that, and I would hope that as we go forward, we will build upon it. And when we come back, which we will have an equitable society for all. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
By the way, Mr. Speaker, you're doing a fine job today. Thank you.
Well, you all are doing a fine job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, throughout our history, the American people have mobilized in extraordinary and unprecedented ways in times of national crisis. But the enemy we face today has required a different response. To defeat COVID-19, we have asked most Americans to do what comes so unnaturally to them: stay home. We have asked businesses to shutter, employees to stop going to work, and churches to close. Entire industries have lost their consumer base overnight. The American people didn't cause this crisis, but are responding the way they always do, by being smart, tough, and compassionate. We owe it to them to give them this support. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, not because it's perfect or even sufficient, but because the lives and the livelihoods of Americans are at risk. And so this bill provides immediate cash assistance. It allows for unemployment benefits. It puts direct money in the hands of small businesses who are struggling in my district. It creates $100 million in assistance to hospitals, something Minnesota hospitals are desperately in need of. And it creates $150 billion in necessary funding for state
Gentleman from
and
Maryland
local
reserves.
government.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to vote yes enthusiastically. This is a big bill, but the American people are bigger. They will respond to the present threat as Americans have always faced grave challenges, as free men and women with deep reservoirs of strength, capability, and when summoned, duty and confidence. It is the duty of some to mobilize this government to backstop the economy, the duty of some to isolate, to blunt the contagion, the duty of some to face the risk tending the afflicted, and fellow Americans, the duty of the rest of us to mobilize the unstoppable force of the American economy to provide supplies, innovate technologies, and enlarge healthcare capacities to meet the needs of all and to defeat this enemy. With God's help, this virus is no match for the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, one time, because we're getting towards the end, can you give us the time that each side has?
The majority has, the gentleman from Maryland has 15 and a half minutes. Gentleman from Texas has 20 minutes.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are good parts of this bill. The things President Trump asked for at the very beginning, like tax relief for employers, help for those who lost their jobs, funding for the medical community and first responders. And I thank President Trump for his excellent leadership. I had a couple ideas I'd like to offer as amendments to this bill, but this is a closed process. 435 members of Congress can't even offer amendments. That's not the way we're supposed to make legislation, especially one that spends $2 trillion. There are parts of this bill that's also unrelated to the coronavirus, $1 billion for Amtrak, money for National Public Radio and the arts. But what we're not talking about is how we're going to pay for this. $2 trillion. We all agree about spending $2 trillion, but how do you pay for it? We're going to borrow it from China? We're going to borrow it from Russia? We're just going to print the money and devalue our current currency? That's not being talked about. The interest on the national debt every year is already about $500 billion every year going forward. We could use that money to pay for epidemics like this and fund our troops. So going forward, we need to talk about balancing our budget and paying for things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back, balance my time.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last week, 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment. Small businesses around this country are shuttering. Millions of Americans and their children are at home practicing social distancing, a term that few knew 2 weeks ago. Countless others are on the front lines in our hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmacies, or simply checking us out at the grocery store. Yesterday, I spoke to many small businesses in my district on a call. I was asked to give them hope. To the American people who are watching, there is hope, and help is on the way. There are many things in this bill I do not like. There are portions that I think are a mistake. But colleagues, this is our time for action. Do not hold this bill up. We owe it to the citizens of this great country who are struggling. We owe action for them today, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last pandemic. I want to draw attention to the research investments in the CARES Act. The Department of Energy has funds for its high-end computing capabilities. The National Science Foundation will do molecular and cellular research. NIST will ensure the validity and the reliability of the testing. And the EPA will do research on the risk of transmission. Mr. Speaker, my grandfather lost his wife and first son in the flu epidemic in 1919. Yet this is not the last novel virus. But with a bold, sustained commitment to science, we can make COVID-19 the last pandemic. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, our country finds ourselves in uncharted waters. None of us have ever experienced anything like this before. For the past 2 weeks, I've been at home in the 1st District of Georgia, visiting with individuals, with small business owners. I've seen something I've never seen before. I've seen people who are concerned about their health, concerned about their future. Mr. Speaker, this is something we have to address. I've also seen something I've never seen before either. And that is people pulling together, people doing for each other, people caring for each other, volunteering at food banks, volunteering at service organizations. I've seen healthcare workers putting their own health at risk to deliver services. I've seen the best of America as well. Mr. Speaker, it is our opportunity here, our responsibility to help these people, to deliver to them. No, this is not a perfect bill. If I had an opportunity, I'd change a number of things in it, but it is what we need to do, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, more than anything, what we need to do is we need to pray. We need to
Gentleman's
pray
time's
to
expired.
the God of
Gentleman
Abraham,
from Texas
to the God
reserves.
of David.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Michigan, Dan Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. This is an unprecedented moment for this country, and it's important that this Congress respond in a way consistent with this threat. We have differences about this bill. There are things in it that many of us don't like. But this moves us forward. This gives the American people the support they need in order to follow the medical advice that they are given without putting their families at risk. It supports small businesses. It puts money in the hands of Americans so that they can take care of their families financially while they're taking care of the health of their families. I support
Maryland
this
reserves.
legislation.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, General Bergman.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This legislation takes major steps to support American workers and families during this unprecedented time. It provides increased funding to get our healthcare workers essential supplies and equipment. It also helps small businesses who have been asked to close their doors and sacrifice their livelihoods for everyone's health and safety. This bill is not perfect. I'm disappointed that we're paying for things that don't have anything to do with COVID-19. And I'm concerned about inadvertent damage we may be doing to our seasonal businesses by incentivizing people to stay at home rather than go back to work once shelter-in-place restrictions are lifted. Small seasonal businesses are the lifeblood of Michigan's 1st District, and as we implement this policy, I will do everything I can to prevent unintended consequences from happening. The people of Michigan's 1st District are resilient. We have survived hardships before, and we will again. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Gentlelady from New Hampshire is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to support this unprecedented emergency relief for the American people. My colleague Chris Pappas and I have spoken with tens of thousands of our constituents through telephone town halls and conference calls with hospitals. I want to support for our people who have lost their jobs, for our small businesses, but most importantly for our frontline healthcare workers in our rural hospitals. We need supplies. We need support. Thank you for voting yes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Businesses large and small, through no fault of their own, are failing. We told them to shut down, and workers are losing their jobs. And let me clear something up for everyone. A lost job is a lost job, whether from a large business or a small business. And it's devastating for families. Americans need help. Thankfully, this bill covers it all, from direct aid to accelerated loans. But when every day counts in a crisis, this bill was delayed by Democrats unnecessarily for a totally unrelated progressive wish list. I don't get mad, but this made me mad. And in the end, the final bill today is barely different than last weekend, and the record will show that. But we have it now, and we should pass it now. It will soften the upcoming hardship, but we must not be complacent, for we have more difficult decisions ahead. How will we balance the opening of society with the pandemic? It's a tough question, and we won't be able to answer that question if the antics of this week continue. The country wants us to move forward together as Americans, not as petty, opportunistic partisans. We can beat this, but only if we do it together.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
My home state of New York has become the epicenter of this terrible pandemic.
This bill brings financial support to increase the number of hospital beds, equip our brave doctors, nurses, EMTs, and other medical providers who are front line of defense and who should not be asked to risk their lives to save others. This crisis will pass, our economy will recover, but American families and workers who lost their jobs by the millions to no fault of their own desperately need this financial support now. This bill provides important grants and loans to small businesses, which will be critical to our economic recovery. There's more for us to do, but this bill is an important first step to secure American families and workers.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was 5 or 6, I had a Sunday school teacher tell me a story that relates to a little bit what we're doing right now. A small child went missing in the Plains States. The community went 100 different directions. They didn't find the child. There was no results. They finally came together. They prayed to God, asked him for wisdom. They ended up holding hands and walking across the prairie. Mr. Speaker, they found that child. This country needs to remember that, and this body needs to remember that. I think we need to put our partisanship aside. We need to quit bickering. We need to ask Almighty God for wisdom and do what's right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You're doing a fine job.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the CARES Act. Over 2,500 Illinoisans have been diagnosed with the coronavirus, 26 of whom have died. Countless more are in need of testing, and thousands of our frontline healthcare workers are desperate for PPE. Just this month, over 130,000 Illinoisans have lost their jobs. This is unprecedented. The CARES Act provides immediate economic relief to individuals, billions in small business loans and grants, and improved unemployment protections. It will help states, local governments, and healthcare systems meet the enormous challenges that they are facing. And I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, head of the Pro-Life Caucus, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman is recognized.
As of today, Mr. Speaker, in my state alone, 6,800 people have been tested positive with 81 deaths, and in one family alone, 4 members of the family have died. Containing the pandemic, developing and deploying reliable therapeutics and a safe and effective vaccine must be our highest priority, no matter the cost. People, especially those in the front lines, in healthcare, first responders, are heroically meeting the challenge, often at great personal cost. The $2.2 trillion CARES Act is comprehensive and absolutely needed. It provides unprecedented support for taxpayers, small businesses, grants to hospitals, helps state and local governments, boosts unemployment, and food security. Special thanks to all of those on the House and Senate side, the leadership, for their cooperation in this bill, and to President Trump, the Vice President, Dr. Birx, and Dr. Fauci, and many others who have brought their expertise to confronting this huge challenge. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the CARES Act, and I'm so proud of the emergency housing priorities, including a temporary moratorium on evictions, foreclosures of homeowners, and federally backed mortgages. There's $4 billion for emergency grants for homelessness, $5 billion for CBDGs, and $1 billion for project-based rental assistance. We are in this fight together, and we will not be broken. Viruses come and go, but the courage of the American people
the gentleman has
endures.
expired.
God bless you all.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to the chairman of the Values Action Team, the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you. We're at war against an unseen enemy our world has never faced before. We are battling on 2 fronts, the healthcare front and the economic front. Thousands of people are sick, with courageous healthcare workers battling on the front lines. Meanwhile, millions of Americans have lost their jobs because of the virus, imperiling family budgets and devastating our economy. Today's bill sends needed battle reinforcements to both fronts. It provides funds to purchase more medical supplies and to support our hospitals, while also sending much-needed help to businesses so that they can make payroll and keep the doors open. It sends money directly to almost every household and supports those who have lost their job due to the COVID crisis. Most importantly, it gives this nation hope. Hope that we will get through this by supporting our healthcare workers, enabling businesses to stay open, and sending Americans funds needed to get them through. While this bill is far from perfect and the price tag is sobering, I believe we are in an unprecedented battle, and it is imperative we win this war. I will be voting yes, and I invite all Americans to join us in this battle.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland.
Excuse me. I yield 30 seconds. 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espelot.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the CARES Act. Mr. Speaker, it would be criminal not to support billions of dollars for our hospitals and healthcare workers. It will be criminal not to support billions of dollars for our small businesses that will struggle. It will be criminal not to support help for working families, $1,200 for individuals, $500 for child. But it is also criminal to leave out immigrants. They clean our houses, take care of our children and our elderly. It's also criminal to shortchange New York, which has become the epicenter of this epidemic. The delay of ventilators and PPEs has also been criminal. Remember, all of you, New York is your future.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would rather die than see my country stumble or fall. And by God, I mean that, and I don't think I'm the only one in this body that feels this way. And I have worried that as a result of a virus that was born in a disgusting market in Wuhan, China, that was hidden from the world, that our country may stumble. But I can tell you that that worry has subsided quickly for me as I looked around my own community and realized again that Americans are a salty group of tough SOBs that are defeated by absolutely nothing. And this isn't going to defeat us either. There's parts of this bill that I don't like, but I am proud that when Americans wake up tomorrow, they're going to continue to know that we wake up here not as victims, but as people with a greater opportunity than anybody across the world. 50 stars, 13 red and white stripes. We get to decide for ourselves if today is better than yesterday, this week is better than next week, this year, this month is better than last month, and next year, and so on. Nobody else gets to decide that for us. That hasn't changed, and it will never change. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Connor Lamb.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I know a firefighter who is going into sick people's homes still today with no mask. We all talk like this is war, but did George Marshall, a Western Pennsylvanian, wait for U.S. Steel to join the war effort in their own good time? No. He used to say, you cannot fight against the problem, you have to decide it. We have given this government money. We cannot give it leadership. Now is the time to decide this problem. Take this money, buy the masks, build the ventilators, protect our people now.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Ragabagan.
Gentlelady from American Samoa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in overwhelming support of this bipartisan legislation. The country needs it, and American Samoa desperately needs it. American Samoa has unique economic and geographic challenges. So far, my constituents are without any coronavirus testing at all, as NBC recently reported. The Army Corps has reported our LBJ hospital needs over $100 million in minimum improvements just to meet compliance standards. I want to thank the President for his leadership, and I thank my colleagues for including my request that the Pacific Territories and the freely associated states are in the definition of state, so all pandemic unemployment assistance programs apply to us. Our people are strong, and their faith is strong. Let's get this funding to work and provide testing in American Samoa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may God bless us all. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from New York, again, the epicenter, who knows this firsthand, Ms. Yvette Clarke.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I rise today in support of the CARES Act. My colleagues have spoken about the provisions of this bill, and although it is not perfect, it is a necessary one. We must now protect my constituents in the 9th District of New York, the epicenter, and all Americans across this country. New Yorkers have been through 9/11, the financial meltdown, Superstorm Sandy, and now we're in the midst of COVID-19. In my city, New York City, we're not just facing economic ruin, but also a genuine health crisis. That's why it's so critical that Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining on both sides?
The gentleman from Texas has 10½ minutes. The gentleman from Maryland has 11 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge strong support for the CARES Act. For years, my colleague and I from across the aisle, Anna Eshoo, have worked, and we worked to pass the Pandemic All Hazardous Preparedness Act that was signed into law in June of 19. For years, we have said it was not a matter of if we would have a pandemic, but when we would have a pandemic. That when is now. And now is not the time to place blame. Now is not the time to look back. Now is the time to act and to look forward. Now is the time to restore confidence in this body. Now is the time to pass this act for those healthcare workers who are staying at the hospital while they're begging us to stay home. Now is the time for all those school children who are watching this body, thinking about and learning about this body, to show them that we can come together and govern. Now is the time to pass the CARES
Gentlelady's
Act.
time's expired. The gentleman from Texas
May God bless
reserves.
America.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to Mr. Sablon, who represents the Northern Marianas, and he does such an excellent job. Thank you very much. Yield 30 seconds.
Gentleman from the Northern Marianas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation we are considering to stop the coronavirus is not perfect. No legislation ever is, and we have more work to do. But even amid crisis, we should not forget to say thank you. For the third time, Speaker Pelosi has led this House to respond forcefully to the coronavirus, to give healthcare providers the resources, families financial aid, to support workers and businesses. And throughout this unprecedented time, always the Speaker and her leadership team remembered the United States of America includes the people of the Northern Mariana
Gentleman's
Islands.
time's expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserves.
Thank
Gentleman
you.
from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
New York is the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis today, and I want to thank our North Country heroes on the front lines, our nurses, our doctors, our hospital personnel, EMS, first responders, teachers, grocers, and truckers. The better angels of our nature are among us each and every day. Volunteers coming forward, quilting groups in the Adirondacks, students using 3D printers, mask making from Sackett's Harbor to Saratoga Flag. This emergency bill needed to pass yesterday. It needed to pass last week. New Yorkers and this nation need this relief immediately for our hospitals, healthcare heroes, and hardworking families. This country is a resilient nation. From the revolution to the Civil War to the pandemic flu to 9/11, we will overcome this. Congress needs to step up, do our job, pass this rescue package today for New York State and for the American people, and I yield back.
Back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it now gives me great honor to yield to the chairman of the Democratic caucus, the gentleman from New York, again the epicenter of this challenge that we have as a country, Hakeem Jeffries.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We also have assembled
the mightiest military, but you cannot judge the greatness of America based on our wealth or our military might. We should only judge the greatness of America based on how we stand up for the least, the lost, and the left behind. The CARES bill is legislation that will help and provide relief to the most vulnerable amongst us. It will provide relief to everyday Americans. It will provide relief to small businesses. It will provide relief to displaced workers. The coronavirus is a silent assassin and has targeted the American people. But we are a resilient nation. We defeated the Great Depression. We defeated Nazi Germany. We defeated Jim Crow. We will defeat COVID-19 as well. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I once again inquire as to the time?
The gentleman from Texas has 8½ minutes. The gentleman from Maryland has 9½ minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bost.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the CARES Act. Even in rural southern Illinois, there are 27 cases in my district. Folks, we need to come together in a bipartisan manner with this bill to deal with, first, the health of our constituents. Second, the health of their pocketbooks in this bill. Third, those businesses where they need to go back to work, whether it's a small business or a large business. This bill does that. Is it perfect? No. But it is the right step forward that we need to do and do today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to our distinguished Vice Chair of our caucus, Catherine Clark from Massachusetts.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the CARES Act. Americans are facing a public health crisis that is an unprecedented threat to the health and safety of our communities. Hospitals are struggling to care for our communities and get the protective equipment they need. The pandemic has brought schools, businesses, and whole states to a standstill, including my home state of Massachusetts. Americans are calling for help, and today we will vote to bring them relief and offer them a lifeline, but it won't be the end of our support. To those on the front lines, healthcare workers, cashiers, child care providers, truck drivers, cleaners, and postal workers, and to all Americans, we say, we see you. We appreciate and are grateful for your sacrifice, and we will continue to fight for the people. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the citizens of the 1st District of Virginia to say that America's glass is still half full. While we face this unprecedented challenge, we see across our nation the resolve and the spirit of America. It is alive and well. While this is a challenge for us here in Congress to show the same spirit and resolve to get the job done for the American people. While this bill is far from perfect, it will demonstrate that we can come together and show what we have seen in the days past of what's going on across America. Folks, America's best days are still to come, and we continue to be the greatest nation the world has ever known. May God continue to bless our great United States of America.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, now I would like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from
30 seconds.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the American people want to know that their government will be there for them. They want to know that their tax dollars will pay dividends for them. They want to know that we will promote the general welfare as extolled in the preamble to the Constitution. They want to know that we will not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. This is not a perfect bill. It is a good bill. I will support it. The American people need certainty. They want to know that we will be there for them.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the good people of eastern Kansas. The war analogy has been thrown around a lot these days, and as a man who's been to war and spent many years there, I can tell you that's not altogether inaccurate. In both cases, people are frightened. In both cases, people die. And in both cases, people discover what it is they're made of. And when war, just like now, people need to come together. This bill is an example of having done just that. It's not perfect, but it's what we've got. It's got my vote. I'd urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Well, I think probably we're going to have to ring the bells.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would now like to yield to a senior member of the House and a cardinal from Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for 1 minute.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a proud Floridian, I rise to protect our workers, health professionals, small businesses, and veterans from this grave crisis we face. Senate Republicans drafted a corporate-friendly bill that failed to meaningfully support the millions who are losing their jobs. Instead, Democrats secured a package that invests $2 trillion in families, hospitals, and small businesses. Workers will get massive investments in unemployment benefits and an added 13 weeks of benefits, which Republicans fought to deny. Working-class families will get as much as $3,400 for a family of 4. Small businesses will get help to make payroll, rent, and utility costs. I'm proud that the Appropriations Committee spearheaded nearly $20 billion to ensure veterans' health needs are met, whether at the VA or local ERs and clinics. Appropriators have also worked to ensure our VAs can assist our local communities if they reach full capacity. This package is not perfect and more help will be needed, but our families, small businesses, and hospitals need this help desperately. I ask my colleagues to give them this lifeline against this invisible enemy. We are all in this together. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We also reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield to the former president of the University of Wisconsin, president of the University of Miami, and secretary of Department of Health, one of our most knowledgeable members about issues of families and workers, the distinguished Secretary Donna Shalala, Congresswoman from Florida.
For how much time, please?
For 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Excuse me. 30 seconds. We have a lot of people going here.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, today we send the CARES Act to the President to provide the people in my community with the needed relief from the devastation of this pandemic. I'm here for the first responders, the healthcare workers, and all of those who are risking their lives. They are our heroes. Mr. Speaker, we need to support this bill now because we must. The virus has left us with no choice. But my hope is that after we have starved this virus, we will make a national commitment to permanently rebuild our public health infrastructure.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now another member of South Florida, and all three of them have spoken now, indicating the importance of the crisis that confronts us. Debbie McCarcel-Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
How much time?
30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As of this morning, the U.S. has the most COVID-19 cases worldwide. Over 1,200 have tragically lost their lives. In Florida alone, we have over 2,300 cases, 652 in Miami-Dade County, 14 in Monroe County. South Florida is quickly becoming another epicenter of this pandemic. We are watching how numbers for unemployment are skyrocketing. Small businesses are closing. It's a tough reality to face, but we in Congress can do something. We can come together, set aside our ideological differences, and help people now. And that's why I support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Abby Finkenauer, for 30 seconds.
I'll give her time to prepare that podium there. Gentlelady from Iowa is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the great state of Iowa, where literally just moments ago, before I got up here to speak, I found out we lost another 2 Iowans to coronavirus, now up to 3, all in my congressional district. Today, we are grieving losses all over the country and the globe, where tragically necessary caution came too late. The package we're considering today is not perfect. It will not bring folks back that we lost, but it will give much needed relief to our hospital systems and workers on the front lines and to our working families and small businesses across the country.
Gentleman from
God bless
Maryland
the United
reserves.
States of America.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I have a time check?
And, from Maryland has 5½ minutes. 5½ minutes. Gentleman from Texas has 6½ minutes. Gentleman from Maryland
Gentleman
is recognized.
from Texas, you have 6½ minutes left? Okay, I'll yield now 30 seconds to Colin Allred from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to speak to the people of North Texas, many of whom are under stay home, stay safe orders from smart leaders like Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins and Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson. I know many of you are frightened. I've heard from many of you who are worried about your family's health, your job, and your business. I want you to know that we are on your side. We are with you. We will not let this great country fail, and we will defeat this virus in a way that leaves no one behind. We should follow the examples of our brave first responders. Every American owes them a debt of gratitude, but we can best honor their service by staying home if you can
Gentleman's
and following
time's
the
expired.
orders
Gentleman
that
from
we've been issued. I
Maryland
yield back.
reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, please to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Gentleman from Ohio has 1 minute.
I don't think anyone's happy about the present situation, but the free market did not close the economy. Governments chose that response to an exceptional risk to public health. The various governments made up in our country need to make sure that individuals, families, and businesses affected by their unprecedented decisions remain solvent and that as many people as possible remain employed. Like any war, the enemy votes too, but the sooner we can get lower-risk Americans back to work, the safer most people will feel. In our response, we must always defend our values and the way of life that makes America the world's land of opportunity. God bless you all.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to Mr. Chuy Garcia of Chicago.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the CARES Act, even though it doesn't protect everyone I wish it would, including all immigrants. However, it represents a bold, unprecedented step in protecting workers and bolstering our health care system and in stabilizing our economy, especially our small businesses. That's why I will vote aye. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Madeleine Dean, for 30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the leader. The coronavirus pandemic is a reminder of our common humanity and our interconnectedness. I stand today to say Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Berks County, Pennsylvania, my home district, have been particularly hard hit. There's suffering and courage in my community. We have had 3 deaths. I rise in support of this CARES Act. It is unprecedented. It's a monumental bill to send relief and confidence to those who are suffering, to our workers, to our families, to our children, to our business owners. I am proud to support this bill.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
You ready? You ready? Yes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the leader of the Republican conference, the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for the job you have done in the chair today. We thank you for the work that you are doing. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I want to say to everyone watching us at home right now, we hear your concern, we feel your anxiety, and we know what we need to do. When this year began, Americans were enjoying a level of peace and prosperity unheard of in modern times. The economy was at record highs. Unemployment for American workers was at record lows. Take-home pay was rising, and business closures were falling. And our brave men and women in uniform were protecting us from threats across the globe. But a few weeks ago, we learned about an invisible enemy from a distant land, an enemy like we've never faced before. Now the virus is here. We didn't invite it. We didn't ask for it.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House is not in order. Please, members, take your conversations to the hall. Wait. Gentlemen may proceed.
Now the virus is here. We did not invite it. We did not ask for it. We did not choose it. But we will fight it together until we win together. We will win because we have the best of our country on the front lines. We will win because of the other people in uniform, our doctors, our nurses, our lab technicians, and hospital volunteers. Take one moment and imagine, where would we be without their fortitude? They have the toughest jobs in the world, but they are truly the best in the world. You, our medical professionals, are our heroes. We, this entire body of members of Congress, salute you. We will always win because of our truck drivers, grocery store clerks, postal workers, farmers, and warehouse workers. You're working night and day. You're making a meaningful, measurable difference in the lives of everyone you serve. You are the foundation of everything we will do today. And we will win because of our scientists. Their bright minds and faster cures should give every American peace of mind. We are developing a victory vaccine faster than ever in the history of any virus. On behalf of all Americans and on behalf of all members of Congress, I want to thank those on the front lines for their professionalism and dedication. Another critical front in our war against this virus is the home front, literally. To slow the spread, the government is asking, and in some cases requiring, millions of small businesses and families to put their daily lives on pause and remain at home. I am overjoyed that so many have taken the imperative of social distancing so seriously. Flattening the curve is the most important activity any American citizen can do today. It is even more important now that the virus has arrived in full force. We are asking you to continue to remain at home as much as possible. I know this action carries substantial circumstances. We all saw that tragic news just this week. 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits. We have never experienced that before in our lives, not even in the Great Depression, that many. So what can we do for the hardworking taxpayers, their families, and small businesses, the pillars of the American life, who are doing their part but facing economic disaster through no fault of their own? First, we can recognize that their sacrifice are invaluable service to their fellow citizens. They deserve our eternal gratitude and prayers. Second, and more importantly, we can give them our financial support now, today, so they can weather this brutal storm in the weeks ahead. Which brings me to the rescue package before us today, the CARES Act. If developing tests and treatments and vaccines is America's new arsenal of democracy, the CARES Act is our modern-day all-American Marshall Plan. It is the largest assistance measure in American history, and it is going directly in the pockets of hardworking taxpayers, their families, and small businesses. For everyone affected by this virus, we will be your voice. For those battling the virus, or lost your job, or do not know if you'll have one a month or two from now, I want you to know we're listening, we hear you, and we are working for you. I want to give Leader McConnell a lot of credit. From the beginning, he was committed to a bottom-up, bipartisan, and bicameral process. He honored his commitment, and it shows. The Senate passed this bill by a unanimous vote. Every Republican, every Democrat. It is bold, truly bipartisan, and targeted to achieve the mission at hand. Our top priority is to keep Americans at work. So we aim the efforts to keep Americans employed through two measures. For small businesses and nonprofits, the bill provides 100% federally guaranteed loans for 8 weeks. If that loan is used to pay your employees, or pay your rent, or pay your utilities, it's no longer a loan, it's a grant, because we know what government has asked you to do. Other business gets a retention credit to keep employees on. If, unfortunately, American workers find themselves out of work, this bill offers an additional 13 weeks of unemployment insurance and dramatically expands eligibility. It also makes benefits more generous by adding another $600 across-the-board payment through the end of July. The CARES Act also expands unemployment insurance to cover gig workers and self-employed and nonprofit employees. Additionally, for American families that might need a little extra support, you will start receiving and seeing those checks in 3 weeks. You won't have to wait for months for financial help. Payments will be as much as $1,200 for an individual taxpayer and $500 per child. Finally, this legislation provides critical resources to American healthcare workers and hospitals. Over $140 billion in appropriations to support our health systems. We don't just talk about our respect for the medical heroes among us. We are going to give them the equipment to save lives and the tools they need to protect themselves. The reason for this legislation is to protect American workers, protect American jobs, and protect hard-working American taxpayers. We are providing targeted, temporary, and timely relief to Main Street, not Wall Street. We are not underwriting bad business practices or priming the pump. Ultimately, we are laying the foundation for a rapid economic recovery. This bill is not only a rescue package, it is a commitment. A commitment that your government and the people whom you elected to serve will do everything we can to limit the harm and hardship you face, both now and in the foreseeable future. To the American public, if you do your part, I promise we will do ours. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, it is our responsibility to act, to put aside our differences and do what's right for the American public. Aid must be robust, rapid, and resilient, just like its recipients. We are going to help Americans through this. We are going to do this together. And in the end, we are going to be healthier, stronger, and more united than ever before. Because, as Americans, that's who we are. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to Mr. Cohen from Tennessee.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Words above the Speaker's head at the top of this chamber are from Daniel Webster. He says, "May in our day and generation, may we not perform something worthy to be remembered. Today, we have something worthy before us and something to be remembered. We should all vote aye. I am here to vote aye and to encourage the President to use the Defense Production Act for everyone and to continue talking to the President of China because this is a worldwide pandemic." I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now have the privilege of yielding of the House, who has been so critical in putting this piece of legislation together and focusing on workers and families. I yield to Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California.
The Speaker of the House is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the distinguished Democratic leader, Mr. Hoyer, for yielding and for the manner in which he has enabled so many of our members to participate in this debate today. Thank you, Mr. Hoyer, for your leadership on the legislation and also for leading us today. And I thank Mr. Brady for his leadership as well, for facilitating this conversation. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for keeping us reasonably on time as much as possible for congressional members. Thank you for the strength of your authority as Speaker of, pro tem today. I thank all of our members for their participation on both sides of the aisle, for the seriousness which we have all taken this important challenge. Mr. Speaker, last week, His Holiness Pope Francis said in his world prayer, he said, "Enlighten those responsible for the common good so that they might know how to care for those entrusted to their responsibility." That is His Holiness's quote. And that is the responsibility that we all have. Today, as we have all acknowledged, our nation faces an economic and health emergency of historic proportions due to the coronavirus pandemic, the worst pandemic in over 100 years. As I proceed with my remarks, I want to say to our colleagues who are watching the proceedings from their chambers in the House to come forward and come to the gallery and listen from here, so that when the time comes, we will be prepared to proceed. The distinguished leader on the Republican side, Mr. McCarthy, and Mr. Hoyer have sent a communication to all of you to that effect. But it is very important that you come now. The sooner you come, the shorter my remarks will be. And I want to thank Mr. the distinguished leader on the Republican side for his leadership throughout all of this to achieve a bipartisan legislation and to do so as expeditiously as possible in the House, so that the message will be clear to the American people that whatever concerns we may have and whatever we want to do next, right now we're going to pass this legislation. And that is because so many American families have been touched by this crisis. More than 82,000 Americans so far have fallen sick, a number certain to surge as testing goes forward, and which is already the most in the world. We've gone past China and Italy. More than 1,200 Americans have tragically died. Gives you chills just to think of it. Millions of workers are losing their paychecks, including more than, as has been mentioned on both sides of the aisle, 3.2 million Americans who filed for unemployment last week alone, a staggering record-shattering figure. Countless healthcare workers, first responders, and others fighting on the front lines in this crisis are at great personal risk. The American people deserve a government-wide, visionary, evidence-based response to address these threats to their lives and their livelihood, and they need it now. Again, I acknowledge the bipartisanship on which we bring this legislation to the floor. Late Wednesday night, as the leader acknowledged, the Senate unanimously passed legislation which transformed, in our view, since you acknowledged Leader McConnell, I will acknowledge our distinguished chairman on our side, which they transformed a Republican corporate focus bill into a Democratic workers first focus. And we salute our chairs working in a bipartisan way and in a bicameral way across the aisle and across the Capitol. We were able to dramatically expand unemployment insurance and defeated attempts on the Senate side to claw back the $600 per week added benefits that would provide essential relief to the record number of Americans losing their jobs. And I salute Chairman Richie Neal and Bobby Scott for the work that they did on this. I know this is the work of Ways and Means Committee, and successfully achieved full direct payments for workers. This is so important, ensuring that working class American families will be eligible to receive as much as $3,400 for a family of four. I thank again Mr. Neal and Madam Chair of the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters, who both of them had bigger proposals, but nonetheless advocating for all of this. And by the way, I would suggest, and instead of saying it's going to take a few weeks for the checks to get there, that the administration electronically transfer those direct payments immediately. We ensured in the bill that any taxpayer dollars given to industry goes first and foremost to workers. Workers' paychecks and benefits not used to pay CEO bonuses, stock fund buybacks, or dividends, and the rest. And I thank, and we have secured robust special oversight that will hold the administration accountable for this. And I thank the distinguished chair of the, where'd he go, Energy, the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee, Mr. DeFazio, for his leadership in that regard. I will not try to find all of you because you may be in the gallery as we are encouraging members to come. Here we go. And we're also proud, and again, I want to salute Congresswoman Waters for the work for the having the oversight provisions in the bill for the account that is going to be spending money out. We're also proud to have secured a truly historic investment of hundreds of billions of dollars in hospitals, health systems, state and local governments, ensuring that they have the tools they need to combat the virus. I salute Chairman Pallone, Chairwoman Lowy of the Appropriations Committee, and Chairwoman DeLauro for making so much of all of that possible. And when we talk about state and local government, I want to express pride in our own Governor, Gavin Newsom. He was on the front line of attacking this, as well as my own Mayor Breed, who has disciplined us to shelter in place. For small businesses, thank you, Congresswoman, Madam Chair Velasquez, and working in a bipartisan way, we want fast relief for those in need, including by securing $10 billion for SBA emergency grants of up to $10,000 and making payroll costs, rent, mortgage interest, and utility costs eligible for SBA loan forgiveness. And for the first time, we have grants from the SBA. And thanks to Secretary Mnuchin, he is facilitating this by not just all of the loans going through the SBA, but going through banks with the SBA imprimatur, which makes this all go much faster. For our students, we paused payments for federal student loan borrowers, paused the payments, and suspended wage garnishment and negative credit reporting during this time. For that and for so many other things relating to our students, I thank Bobby Scott, our chairman of Education and Workforce and Labor. And for our veterans, you heard earlier all of these chairmen make these presentations. For our veterans, we secured nearly $20 billion in funding to improve VA's readiness with equipment, tests, and additional care as again, 571 veterans and 85 employees have now tested positive, and I thank Chairman Takano and others on the committee for their leadership. For our homeowners, renters, and homeless creditors, again, I thank, and consumers, I thank Chairwoman Waters for her leadership there. Since the beginning of this crisis, we have fought to ensure that our nation's response puts families first as we go through this. So the first two bills that we worked in a bipartisan way on were about addressing the emergency. The first bill was about testing to ensure that everyone in the country would have access to free testing. Among other things, it had in their issues that relate to research for a vaccine, research for a cure, but many other things addressing the emergency. In the second bill, which also focused on the emergency, we have mask, and many other provisions focused on the emergency, but taking us to this bill today, which is about mitigation. As our distinguished Mr. DeFazio would say, first we had emergency, Then we have mitigation. Doesn't mean we're finished with emergency, but it's moving on to mitigating for some of the economic and health damage caused by this pandemic. Next, we will move to recovery, and hopefully that will be soon. Always, though, addressing the emergency and the mitigation needed. How are we coming, Mr. Leaders? How are we coming with our, our gallery? As we have all said universally, and we say it almost all the time that we come to the floor, no bill is perfect. No bill is perfect. But we want to make sure that at least comes near part of the way to being sufficient. I do think that we should, when we're considering a bill, appreciate for what is in the bill rather than judge it for what is not in the bill. But we do know that we must do more. There's been a constant communication among all of our members, I'm sure on both sides of the aisle, when you're at home or here, with doctors, healthcare providers, laborers, small businesses, nonprofits, faith groups, and scientists on the daily needs and developments in your communities. The on-the-ground reports and clear-eyed thinking we have are essential to crafting our approach to all of this. So again, listening to members on both sides of the aisle and your comments here today, as well as the input that you have been giving in the legislative process, we know that this cannot be our final bill. Yet this bill, again, is I think Bobby Scott called it a down payment. We must advance a fourth bill to address the continued needs. For our fight against the coronavirus, our state and local governments will need vastly more support for preventing, preparing for, and responding to the crisis. Our hospitals and health systems still need vast infusions of funding so they can treat those in need. We must do more. For our healthcare workers, and this has been a current theme on both sides of the aisle, our gratitude for our healthcare workers. They are our heroes. We're thankful and grateful to them. We pray for them. But we need to do more for them than just to say those words. Our frontline healthcare workers, and whether emergency needs, our firefighters, our law enforcement, face a dire lack of medical and personal protective equipment. PPE, personal protective equipment. That's the reference that when you see PPE, that's what it is. We must ensure that the President uses the Defense Production Act to its full extent to provide the tools that we need to combat this crisis. All workers are risking their lives on the front lines of this fight and need stronger OSHA protections to keep them safe. Thank you, Mr. Scott. This week, for example, and you probably all have examples. This week, we learned of the tragic death of Caius Kelly, a nurse manager in New York who died in the line of duty from coronavirus. He and his fellow nurses risked their lives without proper protective equipment because the hospital supply simply did not have enough. Nurses were given a single plastic protective gown to use for an entire shift, when protocol called for a change of gowns between interactions with patients. Other nurses were forced to resort to tying bandanas over their faces in place of proper equipment. And still others even began tying plastic garbage bags around disposable scrubs that they were given in place of proper scrubs for extra protection. As Mr. Kelly's sister said, his death could have been prevented. I'm angry. He was healthy. And now our nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, and first responders need action. We have to make sure they know that help is not only on the way, but it is a priority for all of us. These people risk their lives trying to save other people's lives, and then they take home what they interacted with in an infected environment, take home. This is just asking far too much. Our families, our workers, our retirees still need more money in their pockets to protect their income security. with increased SNAP. One thing we couldn't get in the bill was the 15% increase in food stamps for our children, for our seniors, for those who qualify. Bigger direct payments. I hope that we'll be in agreement. I know that Richie and Maxine had the idea of ongoing direct payments, so bigger direct payments. Pension protections. We had a protection in the legislation. It was supported by everyone. The President of the United States supported it, but Senator McConnell said he would save it for the next bill. So that's why I'm mentioning it for the next bill. And then we need more expanded family and medical leave. Let me give you an example. Come on, my colleagues, to the gallery. Let me give you an example. If your parent is sick but had ongoing caregiver in the home or went to a senior health center on a daily basis, and because of the virus, that caregiver couldn't come or that health center was closed, you would be able to take family and medical leave. However, as in the case of many members here, if your mom or your dad are healthy and they contract the coronavirus, you would not be able to take family and medical leave. What we would like that to say is for those who cannot care for themselves, it just doesn't make any sense in my view. So in any case, we need that, and without exception. And all Americans need free coronavirus treatment so they don't have to fear the high cost of a hospital stay and others. When we said that the tests were free, it didn't mean that the test is free, but your visit to the doctor is not. And so in the days and weeks to come, Democrats will continue to advance legislation to meet the urgent needs of all affected by the coronavirus. And I keep saying the coronavirus because in this bill, people say, well, how come we didn't do this or that? Because this is specific to the coronavirus challenge that we have. I just want to say a word about our children as I close. So many of our children, I want them, if they're paying attention, distinguished Congresswoman Brooks mentioned the children. We're so sad for them that they cannot be fully engaged in school as they were. Some have access to remote learning and the rest. And this has had a deep impact on American life as it affects our children as well. When I see that some graduations have been canceled, and hopefully not so many more if we can get through this. And I've been, as a mother of 5, grandmother of 9, personally, but officially in my leadership role, I have seen hundreds of thousands of graduates. And what's exciting about it personally and officially is to see the excitement of the families when their child graduates. But when that family happens to have someone on the stage who is the first in the family to graduate, the pride, the joy, the patriotism, all of it is so exuberant, and many of them will be deprived of that experience of seeing that child walk across the stage. So let's try to get this. We had the best minds working 24/7, all hands on deck to find a cure. Let's make sure that we give them the resources they need to do so, but at the same time that we obey the science that says shelter in place or whatever it happens to be. So as we go forward, let us pray. Let us remember what His Holiness told us. What he told us was that we have a responsibility for the common good. So let us prepare for all the loved ones who have lost family members and others who are struggling with the illness now. Let's pray for our heroic healthcare workers and first responders who are risking their lives to care for the sick every day, the men and women in our factories making more medical supplies and personal protective equipment, the farmers, producers, and grocery workers keeping food on the shelves, our truck drivers, postal workers, everybody who is contributing to the effort, and the scientists, as I say, all hands on deck 24/7 for a solution. Congress must show the same courage, same resilience, same strength, and with a great unity and urgency to put families and workers first. Let me again thank everyone who had anything thing to do with this, and that means almost everybody in this room. Let me thank the Senate Democrats and Leader Schumer for his work, as you acknowledge Leader McConnell. And let us again return to the words of His Holiness Pope Francis. May we enlighten those responsible for the common good so that they may know now to care for those entrusted to their responsibility. With that, I hope we have the biggest possible vote for the American people to show them that Congress's heart and the country's heart is full of love for the American people. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no other speakers and prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Thank you,
Gentleman
Leader McCarthy, for your strong and relentless leadership. Thank you for allowing each of us to bring to the table the pro-growth policies that brought about the strongest economy on the planet as we headed into this challenge. Thank to our House leaders, to our ranking members and all the key committees, Representative Grangers and Fox, Representatives Walden, McHenry, Cole, and Shabbat, to each of the members here today who have engaged in this historic agreement, and to the professional teams who have backed us every moment, night and day, in this endeavor. I want to thank our Democratic colleagues for working with us on this bipartisan bill, to our Republican colleagues in the Senate. I especially want to thank Secretary Mnuchin, the point man for President Trump on these negotiations, as well as all of the cabinet, the White House economic team. And I especially want to thank President Trump for his strong and results-oriented leadership at a time of unprecedented crisis for this great country. In times of challenge, I lean on this proverb: fear knocked, faith answered, no one was there. Coronavirus has knocked at America's door, and with it, fear. Faith is answering. We answer with faith in ourselves and our abilities, faith in our free enterprise system, faith in our amazing healthcare system, and yes, faith that when the chips are down, Congress can come together with our president to help hardworking families and businesses when they need it most. We answer that door at this crucial moment with faith in our Creator and faith in our great American spirit. This is the challenge of a lifetime. But if we keep pulling together, if we pass this bill today without delay, we take another step toward that day when we answer the door and fear is no longer there. On behalf of President Trump and the Republican Congress, we urge support for this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as has been said so many times on this floor, America has faced many threats, some in the nature of attack by enemies, some in the nature of natural disasters, whether they be hurricanes or tornadoes or floods. And Americans have responded and overcome those threats. We now have a threat, as some have mentioned, that is unseen, but has a great effect, and is having a great effect today as we debate this bill in America. And today we will vote not as Democrats or Republicans, but we will vote as Americans who have been sent here to represent our country and our people, to promote the general welfare. Certainly the general welfare has been put at risk by this virus. We have, in a very short time, passed 3 major pieces of legislation 2 that generated in this House, 1 generated in the Senate. And we will pass this bill today. I want to thank the Majority Leader. Excuse me, the Minority Leader. I'm the Majority Leader, right? You can't have it. And while we enjoy a little levity, we understand the gravity of this situation. People will die today as a result of this virus. And we have come together as Democrats and Republicans from every region of this country to respond in a way sufficient for the challenge. And we know we'll need to do more. But this day, let us hope that, like the United States Senate, we come together, each and every one of us, not for partisan advantage, but for the advantage and defense of our people. America has been blessed by God and by our people. Let us respond this hour to their need in their defense so that America will go forward stronger and better and more ready to face future challenges. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 911, the previous question is ordered on the motion. The question is on adoption of the motion. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purposes, gentlemen, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I came here to make sure our republic doesn't die by unanimous consent in an empty chamber, and I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise and remain standing until counted. An insufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is refused.
Mr. Speaker.
Is the gentleman recognized?
I object on the basis that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
The chair will count for a quorum. Counted for a quorum is present. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Section 7B of House Resolution 891, the House stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on Tuesday, March 31st, 2020.